So now, finally, after so much work, we can now talk about adding two fractions with like denominators. So this is the first thing that we can do. Now we have the framework to add two fractions with the same denominator. Again, I'm going to start out with a verbal description of precisely what we're going to do when we add two fractions with the same denominator. I know that writing out these verbal descriptions might be a little bit labor intensive, might be a little bit, some might say pedantic, but I want you to get used to seeing these verbal descriptions and using them as a tool to train your brain to think more clearer about the concepts and about how to do it, as well as a guide to performing these calculations for yourself. And I'm going to walk you through that right now. But first, let me read this to you out loud. The sum of two fractions with like denominators is the fraction, so the sum is going to be a fraction, whose numerator is the sum of the numerators of the two fractions being added, and whose denominator is the denominator that the two fractions being added have in common. Okay, so let's read that again. The sum of the two fractions with like denominators is the fraction whose numerator is the sum of the numerators of the two fractions being added, and whose denominator is the denominator that the two fractions being added have in common. Now, let me give you a brief example to show this to you. Let's pretend that I have 2/3 and I'm going to add 1/3. Well, what does this tell us to do? Well, it says that the sum of these two fractions with the like denominator, do they have the like denominator? Yes. In this case, they both have the denominator 3. So now we know we can proceed forward. What is that sum going to be? It's going to be the fraction whose numerator is the sum of the numerators of the two fractions being added. So what are the numerators of the two fractions being added? 2 and 1. And so the numerator of the sum is going to be the sum of 2 and 1. In other words, 2 plus 1. And the denominator of this sum is going to be the denominator that the two fractions being added have in common. These two fractions have the 3 as the common denominator. So that is going to be the denominator of the sum. And so finally, when we add this numerator, it's going to be 2 plus 1, which gives us 3. And on the bottom, we're going to have 3. And so this then is the sum that this gives us. And of course, we can simplify this to 1. Now, we have not yet talked about simplifying fractions, but in this case, because we had talked about how any fraction that has the same numerator and denominator equals 1, I'll simplify it for this particular case, but we will talk about simplifying fractions at a later time in more detail again. So now let me show you visually what's going on here. Here, I have 2/3. So I have this much here. Let's say this is a rectangular lasagna that I made, and this is obviously how much I'm going to eat of it, because because I want to eat this much. And then this is the other piece this is what's being added to it. Okay, we're going to put a plus sign there. We can't add two lasagnas together, but we can add these two images to give us an idea of what's going on. So this is my 1/3 of my lasagna. So if I take this 1/3 and I put together, if I take this 2/3 of the lasagna and I add a 1/3 of the lasagna, you can see that that's what's missing here. And so what would we get? We would get the whole lasagna, which is 3/3. And so you can see that this procedure makes sense. And so that is our first example of adding two fractions with like denominator. Ta-da!